Welcome to Royal History UK, where the past comes alive.
Okay, picture this for a second. You are a medieval king. You've got a whole empire to run. We're talking massive armies to feed, towering stone castles to build, roads to maintain, and enemies sitting at literally every single border. To keep it all from falling apart, you just need to collect some taxes. Seems simple enough, right? But here is your massive, glaring problem. The vast majority of the subjects you rule over possess almost zero actual money. And that brings us to the core mystery of today's explainer. How exactly does a king tax a farmer who has almost no coins to give? How did these medieval governments manage to fund huge continental armies, build those incredible stone fortifications we still see today, and run sophisticated legal systems in an economy that was completely cashless? Because back then, wealth wasn't sitting in a purse, it was out in the fields.
You see, there's this massive contrast between how we view wealth today versus back then. When we think about wealth today, it's super abstract, right? Digital bank accounts, stocks, coins. But medieval wealth was incredibly physical. A prosperous medieval farmer was actually doing pretty well by the standards of his day. He might have 10 acres of good land, a barn absolutely full of grain, some livestock, and solid iron tools. But if you, the king, rocked up and asked this prosperous farmer to hand over 20 silver coins, well, he'd look at you like you just asked him to hand over a living, breathing dragon. It just wasn't gonna happen.
Section 1. The Cashless Kingdom. To really wrap our heads around this cashless kingdom, we have to look at the literal dirt beneath their feet. Land was the undeniable engine of the entire medieval economy. I mean, if you strip away all the pageantry and the knights in shining armor, feudalism was essentially just a giant hydraulic system designed to pump agricultural surplus upward to the guys with the swords. Since nobody had cash, the most obvious fix was taxation in kind. You just physically take the grain, the livestock, and the timber. Now, if you're a local lord, taking a share of grain at harvest time works great for feeding your own house. But if you're a king trying to fund a military campaign 300 miles away, suddenly you're looking at a total logistical nightmare. You need carts to move the grain, armed guards to protect the carts, and huge storage facilities. And every single step of that journey introduces spoilage, theft, and costs that just skyrocket. Grain was local wealth, but the state desperately needed to project wealth over long distances.
So if moving grain is a total bust, what's plan B? Well, you tax human time. Rulers harnessed actual biological energy as currency through something called corvée labor. The state essentially forced their subject populations to literally dig ditches, build bridges, and repair castle walls with their bare hands, completely uncompensated. A king didn't need a budget to build a road, he just used his legal authority over his subjects' time. But there's a hard biological ceiling here. If you force a farmer to work on a lord's estate for 3 days a week, that is 3 days he isn't growing his own food. Push that too far, and you risk starving the worker's own fields, effectively destroying the very productive capacity you're trying to exploit.
Section 2. Tolls and the Church. Because of those biological limitations, kings had to get pretty creative. And that leads to our next, and honestly sometimes dangerous, methods of extraction. Squeezing trade routes and going toe-to-toe with the massive, entrenched wealth of the Catholic Church. 62. That number is just wild to me. At the height of medieval toll collection, a merchant navigating down the Rhine River would hit 62 separate toll stations. Think about that for a second. Some lords literally built stone fortresses on tiny islands in the middle of the river current for no other reason than to ensure ships couldn't pass without paying up. Having the right strategic geography was basically a money-printing machine. But it was a huge trap. Every single toll made those goods slightly more expensive. If you push that logic to the absolute extreme with 62 tolls, you severely risk strangling commerce entirely. Price trade out of existence, the merchants stop coming, and suddenly your fancy toll stations are sitting completely empty. And then you've got the church. By the high medieval period, the Catholic Church was absorbing a staggering 10% of all agricultural output through tithes. And it gets worse for the king because when land passed into church ownership, it fell into what was called the dead hand, or mortmain. It essentially vanished from the taxable feudal network altogether because the church claimed strict secular tax exemption. It was a massive structural threat to the state's survival. So in 1279, King Edward I of England struck back with the Statute of Mortmain, strictly outlawing land transfers to the church without royal consent, just to stop his tax base from shrinking any further.
This tension sets up an absolutely epic showdown in 1296. King Philip IV of France was catastrophically short on cash for his wars. So he decided, you know what, I'm going to tax the French clergy. Pope Boniface VIII immediately threatened to excommunicate him, So how did Philip respond? With pure financial warfare. He completely embargoed the export of gold and silver from France, literally severing Rome's financial supply lines. And it worked. The Pope blinked. He conceded that rulers actually could tax the clergy during national emergencies. Philip managed to crack open the most powerful legal immunity in the medieval world just by starving it of funds.
Section 3. War forces a deal.
You see, war was this staggeringly expensive engine that completely transforms taxation. It changed it from a system of simply taking things by force into a system of actually negotiating political deals. There's a highly predictable, mechanical cycle to all this. First, war requires spending, unbelievable amounts of spending on mercenaries, siege equipment, and war horses. Second, all that spending requires emergency taxation. Third, emergency taxation always generates intense resistance from the barons and the merchants, which leads to step 4, that resistance forces negotiation. The crucial takeaway here is that sheer desperation for war funds forced kings to trade away real constitutional rights, like the Magna Carta, just to get their hands on tax revenue. The transaction was totally explicit. We will give you your tax money, but in exchange you give us legal protections and stop abusing your royal power.
Section 4. The medieval tax trap.
Now, agreeing on a tax in some fancy grand hall is one thing. Actually collecting it out in the mud of the countryside? Totally different story. Let's talk about the massive logistical hurdles here. Today, governments have digital registries and bank accounts to track your money. Medieval kings operated in profound informational darkness. And in that darkness, people naturally hid their wealth. Farmers constantly underreported their grain. And when Edward III tried to slap heavy customs duties on raw wool to fund the 100 Years' War, it instantly spawned this massive, wildly lucrative wool smuggling shadow industry right across the English Channel. Sure, there were a few rare, highly ambitious exceptions, like the super-detailed 1427 Florentine Catasto, which was basically an early census of assets and debts. But mostly, tax evasion was just the rule of the land.
So how do you fight evasion? You need a whole bureaucracy of clerks and assessors, but running a bureaucracy is incredibly expensive. To get around this, states turned to something called tax farming. Instead of doing the hard work themselves, the state just sold the right to collect taxes to private merchant banking syndicates, like the Riccardi of Lucca or the consortiums managing the French salt tax known as the gabelle. The state got a huge pile of cash up front, which was great for them. But they essentially outsourced extortion to private investors, and those investors had exactly one incentive: squeeze the local population as humanly hard as possible to maximize their own profit margins.
And this leads us directly into what we can call the medieval tax trap. Because private tax farmers had absolutely no political obligation to the people, they'd extract wealth right up to the edge of total ruin. Think about it. If you confiscate a farmer's plow team to settle his tax debt this year, he can't cultivate his land. So next year, he produces zero grain and he pays zero taxes. Extracting resources too aggressively literally consumes the very economy that produces those resources in the first place.
Some of the smarter, more canny rulers eventually realized that destroying their own economy was, well, pretty terrible business. They essentially discovered medieval supply-side economics. Rather than just squeezing towns dry, they started granting favorable charters and actually reducing market tools. By taxing them less in the short term, they effectively incubated these incredibly wealthy, coin-rich cities. They'd let commerce grow for a generation, and then later on, they could collect taxes cleanly and efficiently on a massive base of actual coin, rather than having to mess around counting sacks of grain.
Section 5. The breaking point.
That whole incubation strategy was brilliant, for sure, but playing the long game was a luxury, and it was a luxury that was almost always blown to pieces by the terrifying, immediate financial demands of war. Just look at how fast the pressure escalated in 14th century England. First, the Black Death wipes out a third of the population in the 1340s. The workers who survived finally had the leverage to demand higher pay, but the crown just steps in and freezes wages in 1351. Then, desperate to fund the failing 100 Years' War, Parliament imposes a flat poll tax in 1377 at 4 pence per person. By 1381, they triple it to 12 pence. This was wildly regressive. The rich were paying a tiny fraction of their income, while the poor paid a crushing, devastating portion. It was universally hated.
So by May 1381, things completely boil over. A royal official named John Bampton shows up in Brentwood, Essex, with armed guards, trying to forcibly collect unpaid arrears. The villagers straight up refuse, and the situation explodes. Within weeks, you've got thousands of people marching on London, led by Wat Tyler, and heavily radicalized by a preacher named John Ball. They literally stormed the Tower of London
and killed the officials responsible. It's a vital, bloody lesson in history. People do not just rebel against taxes. They rebel when taxes feel like disproportionate, arbitrary theft, imposed completely without their consent.
Section 6. Building the modern state. The governments that learned from that lesson, they survived. The ones that didn't, burned. And from the ashes of all these brutal conflicts and massive rebellions, the modern state as we know it was finally born. The long-term response to this endless cycle of crisis was a massive shift toward permanence. European governments finally started abandoning those messy emergency crisis levies. Instead, they built professional fiscal administrations, they standardized currencies, and they set up continuous revenue systems. Look at France, for example. They established the tithe, which was a permanent direct tax, the aides for indirect taxes, and the jabel, a permanent state salt monopoly where citizens literally had to buy salt from the state at prices the state set. This reliable, continuous stream of revenue finally allowed states to fund standing, professional armies that were loyal to the government itself, rather than just calling up a bunch of feudal lords for a quick summer campaign.
And that brings us to the big takeaway of this entire explainer. Taxation was never just a one-way street of a king shaking down some peasants for coins. The modern constitutional state, all our legal protections, and the very concept of the consent of the governed, they didn't just magically appear out of philosophical thin air. They were born violently out of this primary arena. They came out of kings desperately trying to squeeze wealth from a coinless society and being forced to make incredibly hard constitutional concessions just to get it. So I'm going to leave you with this thought, because it completely reframes how we view our own history. The next time you think about your modern constitutional rights, ask yourself, what part of those exact rights do you owe directly to a medieval farmer who simply refused to hand over his grain to a tax collector without a fight? It is wild to realize that the machinery of the modern state was quite literally forged in the fires of medieval tax disputes.